On tap today, we have Mike James, better known as UKMike. How are you doing today, good sir?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Yeah.
Mike, you are the author of a book called Smoke and Mirrors, and that book details a lot of the Coleco Chameleon saga. And if you'll pardon me for a minute, my audience right now is divided into two groups. There's the people who know this in and out and are eager for us to get into this, and the
Hmm.
other people are like, "What's the Coleco Chameleon? Is that some Power Ranger monster?" So
Yeah.
let me give them a really quick major overview, and then you can give the details. All right?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. The Coleco Chameleon, also known as the retro video game system, was the brainchild of a guy named Mike Kennedy, who's had this idea to make a brand new cartridge based video game system as a small company. The problem was he didn't know how to do it. He tried to raise a lot of money, released four prototypes, all of which were completely fake, and was generally a really, really big scandal in the retro gaming community. So that I think people have enough background info. What would you say to that, Mike?
I think your audience is probably indicative of the general public because, I mean, to those that were either involved or following along, this thing was like a soap opera for months, over a year of our lives, really. But it never really broke the mainstream. So I think, the book kind of takes that into account and starts off really slow and kind of gives some background on the whole story. It's a long book. There is a lot of information in there. So somebody going into this story cold can just pick the book up and read it and figure out everything that's going on because it is laid out for them.
There's a lot of value in that because I tried to just put in the bare essentials in that description there, but like you said, it was a soap opera, and it started off so innocent and so positive because people were like, okay, I could somebody a regular average Joe wants to make a video game system. I don't know why, but I want to see where this goes. And again, four different prototypes were made, all of which were massively fraudulent. And people started to say, "What are you doing to me here?"
Yeah, well, but the book kind of defines it as three prototypes. It's arguable, there were pictures of circuit boards sent out,
Mm-hmm.
and that was people said, "Oh, that's a prototype board." But there were three real defined prototypes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but
Personally, I count the
just
John Carlson prototype, but that's just me.
no, that is what I would term the first one, which was the retro VGS. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was the same idea, but really a different project with a different team when they moved into the Coleco Chameleon. But I think, like you said, something you said reminded me there. Mike was already in the community. He'd been a member on Atari Age for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and he'd done projects that were good. He'd created Game Gavel and various spin-off sites, and he tried to build what he called, his Game Gavel network, all under Game Gavel LLC, and he wanted to create something that gamers could get some use out of, and he did do some good and interesting sites, and the book covers all of those little projects. And then this console thing came along, after Retro Magazine, and another thing that people, the audience was hit and miss on, the quality of the magazine. Some liked it, some didn't, but he tried to do the right thing. Behind the scenes, it was very different, of course. But yeah, the book kind of lays all that out. It goes through and to people who are familiar with Mike and the whole story, the first few chapters may be a little background information they didn't know, maybe some filler, maybe they just want to skip to the console part. But what you'll see is it covers Mike, and this is not a hit piece, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
this book. It covers Mike's progress from, his first auction site, Chasing the Chuck Wagon, which he rebranded later to Game Gavel. And it goes through all the various projects, some of which came to fruition, some of which didn't. But the reason all that's included is because you'll start to see some patterns of behavior. And you'll start to see things that will, if you're familiar with the story, will trigger something. And you think, yeah, I saw that in the console phase. And, these patterns of behavior, the same buzzwords, the Mike Kennedy business model, that's all kind of founded a few years earlier, and the beginning of the book covers all of that.
Like remember from my early collecting days, the three of us were actually on the original, the Usenet group Rec Games Video Classic. And I didn't know you that well. He didn't know me that well or anything, but Mike was there too. And I never had any ill will toward him. I'm not here to talk to you because I just want to gossip about the guy. But there just became this point where it was like, you've given us so much, you promised so much and delivered so little, and you're actually angry at us for asking questions. And that's the part where I personally really got upset, where it was like, we're asking very valid questions from somebody from whom you're asking hundreds of dollars, if not more, and you're giving us nothing.
Yeah, and Mike started out with good intentions, and the full title of the book is Smoke and Mirrors: The Rise and Fall of a Serial Antipreneur, and it covers his rise and fall, as the name would suggest, and it, like I said, it covers some of the good things that he did, and you'll get a feel for where things kind of changed and where those good intentions maybe became less so. Although I always think he wanted to produce a video game console, he just didn't have either the money or the skills to do it himself, and that's where other people who came onto the project came in. He needed them. He couldn't do it himself. I don't think he was an out-and-out scammer. A lot of people accuse him of that. He did genuinely, in my opinion, want to create a video game console, sell it to the public, and make a name for himself in the video game industry, the retro community. And I think that was as important to him as the money was. Although, we're all familiar with the kind of money we were talking, the Kickstarter for the Chameleon, the Indiegogo for the retro VGS was just shy of $2 million. And so we're talking a lot of money, but I think the fame and the notoriety was as important to him as the money was.
I think I can definitely see your point there. And I personally, I've called it a scam many times. I won't say that I haven't, but I definitely see where you're coming from, and that he did actually want to produce something. I guess my thought always goes back to, if you want to produce something and know that you don't have the resources to do it, but yet you're taking money for it, does that functionally become the same as a scam, or is there still a distinction there?
I think the reader is going to have to decide for themselves what their opinion is, whether they thought it was an out-and-out scam, whether they thought he was just taken for a ride. I mean, he was scammed by a known scammer, but what did he ask this mysterious Sean Robinson for? Did he ask Sean for a genuine prototype and Sean scammed him, or did he ask Sean for a fake that was good enough to get on Kickstarter, which is exactly what Sean delivered? It was a fake. And there's a conversation very early on. Like I said, this isn't a hit piece. I lay out all the facts. You can make up your own mind. My opinion will become clear by the time you finish the book. But there are several conversations in the book that will point you in a certain direction, and one of those was very early on with Clay Cowgill, because this thing didn't just start as the retro VGS. There was an iteration before that, and it was called the Back in Time console. And Scott Schreiber, who's also a host on Retro Gaming Roundup with me, co-host, co-founder, along with Mike Kennedy, was involved in those planning calls for the Back in Time console, as was I. And we were talking to people like Phil Adams, Steve Wojter, Ed Fries from the Xbox team who brought us the first Microsoft Xbox. So there were industry luminaries in these calls, and the Back in Time console kind of, well, that's where you learn some of the Mike Kennedy business model. We stopped getting those calls, and it went away for a while, and then it came back as the retro VGS. And Mike was flaky on the details, whether intentional or not. He said he went to Clay Cowgill, who then brought Sean Robinson in. Clay sees it differently. He says Mike and Sean were already working on it when they brought me in. And Clay Cowgill, you may know the man, you may know his name. He is an engineer by trade. He's co-owner of the Ground Control Barcade in Portland. He's well known in the community, and he can design, build, and manufacture and ship a complete product. And Mike went to him for some ideas of, how much would it cost to make this, and how long will it take? And Clay came back to him with the figure. You're looking about $70,000, and I think it was about 14 weeks, something like that, just to get to a finished prototype stage. And Clay's point that he made, he posted it in Atari Age, was the project suddenly turned to, well, what can we do to get on Kickstarter? And Clay's words were actually, it turned into a smoke and mirrors approach. That's where the title of the book comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of leads you down the road towards Mike, maybe he did ask Sean for a fake prototype and got exactly what he asked for.
And I'm trying not to, I don't want to give away too many details because I'm sure the book is definitely going to give me all the facts that I'm really going to need. But those, from my own memory of the events, and by the way, I didn't know anything about the Back in Time console. That's a new chapter for me, and that alone justifies kickstarting the book for me. But just that was kind of what I always looked at, is when I heard about Mike talking about building the prototype and the timeline and the money involved, me knowing very little about the industry, I could already tell that he was not basing any of this in reality. The money he was asking for was not connected to what I would expect those product costs to be at all, much less the timeline, much less the talent. None of it ever made sense. And when you brought that up to Mike, you would just get, hey, just wait, you'll see.
Yeah, and the money's an interesting thing. Mike said at one time nobody can produce a prototype console with an FPGA. If you don't know what an FPGA is, it's covered in the book, don't worry. When we get technical, we do lay it out for the layman to easily understand what we're talking about. And Mike would say that nobody can do it cheaper than us. Kevin Horton did it. Kevin Horton's continuing to do it with his range of consoles. The money was it was just short of $2 million, the Indiegogo for the Retro VGS, something like 1.95 million. That was a number that they got to by adding up what they needed. It was renting offices. It was salary for 3 people working on the project at the time. It was all sorts of other things that just weren't connected to the actual mechanics of producing a video game console. It was kind of, it's like a policeman thinking, well, you did it and I'll make the evidence fit the fact that you did it, rather than following the evidence or the money to where it leads you. It can be done much more cheaply. It has been done much more cheaply. Now, whether Mike believed it or whether Mike was told it and repeated it, you'll have to find out, I guess.
Yeah, and it's just so odd that somebody would just say nobody can do it better than us, when technology is changing all the time. It's always getting smaller, faster, cheaper, and every layman knows this. People such as yourselves and Clay and anybody else in the project would point that out and say, 6 months from now, it's a whole different story, regardless of whether you're even telling the truth now.
Yeah, it's interesting you say, the details kept changing, technology changes. And, there's a figure in the book called John Carlson, and he was much maligned at the time. At the time he was on it because he produced, that regrettable video, the Retro VGS Lab. And people mocked him. Mike put much of the blame for the failure of that Indiegogo on him, which is a part of the Mike Kennedy business model. That's just what he does. When you're on your way out, you're blamed for all the failures, and we move on to the next engineer and repeat to him everything that the previous one has told us. But I spoke to John Carlson, I think 2 or 3 times while doing the research for this book. I think he's a credible engineer. He has made product. I've spoken to other respected people in the community and in the industry, people like Rebecca Heineman I spoke to at Portland Retro Gaming Expo, and we were talking about John Carlson and the whole project. Got a couple of interesting details about her, which are in the book, and she couldn't say enough good things about John. But the details were constantly changing for him. Mike and Steve Woiter were the 2 guys left on the team at this stage. Clay Cowgill had walked away. Sean Robinson was maybe somewhere in the background in the mist somewhere, we don't know. And John Carlson was the engineer, but Mike was constantly saying, we want it to do this, we want it to do that, we want Bluetooth controllers. And so just that one thing, Mike saying, we want the controllers to be Bluetooth. And John would say to him, well, okay, in that case, we need to up our CPU, we need to up our RAM, we need to change this on the board, that on the board, it's going to cost this much extra, which is why, Mike was throwing out the number in the early days of this console is going to be $150, and they ended up nearly $400 for a console, and that's why they ended up there, and that's why John Carlson simply couldn't produce anything, because every time he did, something changed, and it was just a crazy environment that he was working in.
And that's something that people don't seem to get when they deal with tech, either as a buyer or as a seller, is that you make decisions based on what you assume are the facts. You start out from saying, you want to find one fact that is not going to change that you need, and you build off from that, whether that be a feature, whether that be a price, whether that be a look. But there has to be something you start with that never changes, and that seemed to never be the case with the Chameleon.
No, it was constantly changing, and of course the other consideration they had was, of course, Mike Kennedy bought the molds for the Atari Jaguar, and again, that detail is all in the book, how much he paid, where that money came from, where they ended up, because that was all a murky business, possibly corporate fraud, depending if you're interested in looking into it to that depth. But that Jaguar shell, Mike bought them, and that was it. As far as Mike was concerned, I've had this video game console idea, I've got an engineer, and I've got the shells. We're almost there. That was the way he thought. But just using those shells created problems in themselves for John Carlson at that stage and others later to work within the confines of.
Early on in the project, I think it might have even been in the early retro VGS era, there was a podcast released with Mike discussing the things they were doing because they had the Jaguar shells, and that kind of disappeared early on. I had to really dig to find it, actually. But he was speaking as if, they were talking about the depth of the contact metal, and they're talking about real details that you'd think would mean they'd already had the thing hammered out and ready to go. And when you find out 6 months later that even the basic board wasn't designed yet, you're like, well, what were you talking about 6 months ago? It was just amazing that the Jaguar shells really became the only thing that ever was concrete.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about things like that and that kind of detail early on, I would have a guess that would have come from Clay Cowgill. So what Mike would do, he'd get an engineer, like Clay early on. He wouldn't pay them because he didn't have the money to pay them. So they would either be paid in future perceived value, as he called it. So he'd give them shares in his company, or he'd start a new company and give them shares in that. And they would talk to him, have discussions about the console, about the design, and so a technical detail like that would come from the engineer, and that was it. Mike had a new buzzword, and every interview Mike did, every post he made on Facebook, every tweet he did, that information would be in there, and then a new engineer would come along and he'd repeat all these buzzwords to the new engineer, and they would think, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about, and then he would learn more new buzzwords and repeat those, and that was it. A great example is some of the details that Mike would use without understanding them was something like, he talked about Unity. So at one time the console was going to run games built on Unity, and it was going to have the hardware and software to support them. But he also knew phrases like close to the metal, which the Atari 2600, something like that had. Mm-hmm. You turn on the Atari, there's no software on there, there's no operating system, all the code is in the cartridge, and it runs literally on the processor. When those guys wrote those games, they wrote them in assembler, and so that code is running right on the processor close to the metal. And so Mike would then do interviews and talk about, well, this console is going to run Unity close to the metal, which just makes absolutely no sense
whatsoever,
and just shows his lack of understanding in what he was being told, but would happily repeat to everyone who'd listen.
Okay, now since we're talking about stuff that makes no sense, I want to get away from Mike in a minute, but I have to ask this because there was a big thing, a minor spoiler, if you follow the story, you probably already know this. At the New York Toy Fair, the prototype Mike had then was an Atari Jaguar shell with a Super Nintendo inside of it. this was like the moment where it's like nobody could argue that this was fake anymore. There was no spin you could put on it that would come out favorably for Mike. And he had made the point really specifically that the cartridge that somebody gave him, the Super Nintendo cartridge, didn't have the extra pins on the side, which he would expect to see, because some Super Nintendos have a full range of games have a full range of pins, some do not. And he was like, "Oh, this won't work on there," and it was surprised that it did. And I'm like, "You should know this. A Super Nintendo is not an uncommon system. The pin connector it's a very unique shape that anybody who's looked at one once will recognize." Do you think he was honestly surprised by that, or was he just bloviating?
So that is one of many key questions in the book, and the reader will have to make up their mind on it. I'll lay the facts out for you, and you can make your own mind up. I have my opinion, but although my opinion will sort of become clear, it's not. I'm not ramming this down your throat and saying this is what happened, that's what happened. Here are, the events. Here are the facts. So, Mike, the night before he left home for the New York Toy Fair, Sean Robertson delivered that prototype to his house. Said, be very careful with it. It's very fragile. It keeps resetting. As long as you're careful with it, it will get you through the toy fair. When you get back, we'll look at why and we'll deal with it. But he gave very specific instructions. Don't show anyone the back of the console. And so Mike put it in a case and took it to New York, put it in the booth. And if you remember at the New York Toy Fair, it was hidden under a Perspex box. You couldn't actually get to touch the console, and they kind of kept it away from prying hands, hoping to stop the resets or just for display purposes. I don't know. So Mike was in a situation where he'd be playing a game to demo it to somebody in the booth, and the console would just randomly reset. It should reboot, and then it would come back on and it would play again for a few minutes, and then it would reboot again. And so he had a problem with it. And then it started to kind of leak out, He did take a picture of the back of the console. He did put those pictures out, and people started to try to work out what it was. And it became clear very soon after he posted those pictures that what he had in there was a Super Nintendo Mini. Also, not to be confused with the recent, mini version that runs 30 games or whatever. This was the mini version of the original Super Nintendo, sometimes called a Super Nintendo Junior. And the back of the console looked exactly like the back of one of those. And what he also showed off was the cartridge he was using. There's a video of him holding it. This is our prototype cartridge. This is what it is. And again, it had a piece of tape over it, trying to cover details, but it was worked out that what that was a Super Nintendo flash cartridge called the SD2SNES. It was made by a manufacturer and sold by Stone Age Gamer. Now, don't want to get too technical, but basically some of the Super Nintendo games had extra chips in the cartridges to make them do more impressive things. Something like F-Zero, Mario Kart ran something called Mode 7, and you needed extra hardware in the cartridge to run those games in kind of almost a 3D environment, but not really. And to do that, the SD to SNES needed a lot of power. It could do it, it could run those games, but it needed a lot of power, namely an official Nintendo power supply. Otherwise, the game would try and run some really complex routine. There wouldn't be enough power to allow the processor in the card to do that, and the system would reset. So that was another clue to exactly what he was running in there. This wasn't, as he said, a prototype cartridge that his engineer had built. It was a publicly available product, and he knew what it was. Scott, who's a host on our podcast, does a segment there called the Hardware Flashback, and he bought one of these things from Stone Age Gamer. He'd found this problem because he was running it in a Superboy console, which is basically a handheld SNES, and he was seeing those same resets. So he contacted the seller and said, is this faulty? He said, no, that's expected behavior. Get a better power supply, should be fine. And so everyone was posting this. You know, it was on Atari Age. People were posting it on Facebook. Mike was reading it and deleting it. So you get to kind of Saturday afternoon of New York Toy Fair, and Mike is there with his console. It keeps resetting. People are saying it's a Super Nintendo Junior. People are saying he's got an SD to. And so he's in a position then. Show closes on Saturday. What does he do? Does he have a look inside? Does he know what he's looking at if he does look inside? Is he fully aware that he's got of what he's got, that it's a fake? And, if he does take it apart, will it break for the Sunday? And so that kind of steers you down a road. He knew he had a problem. People were telling him what the problem was. What he had on his hands was not an original prototype. And he continued on with the show saying it was. So draw your own conclusions from that.
And for the benefit of the people who don't really follow this stuff like you and I do, the Super Nintendo Junior is not a super rare item to have, but it is considerably less common than the standard Super Nintendo released in 1992 with the big rectangular purple buttons on there. You're not going to see it every day.
No. But ironically, sorry to interrupt, but ironically, Mike later posted a picture kind of late on. I think we're probably in the Chameleon days, or maybe it had just failed, and he tweeted a picture, and it was basically his front room setup. So his big TV's there. He's got, I think, a PS3 or probably then under there, and then right at the side of that is the Super Nintendo Junior. Now, conspiracy theorists will say Mike used his own in the prototype, or Sean told him to use his own in the prototype. Others will say it's just coincidence. I don't know. And that's one of the problems that I had with the book. I didn't interview Mike for the book, and I tried to get some answers off Sean Robinson, who would pretend to be helpful and then would just not reply when anything was needed from him. So let's just say I had spoken to them. Both of them have been found to be liars. And so if I ask Mike a question, at some point he has to lie because he's committed crimes and he would be knowingly defrauding the public. And so at some point he has to lie. And we know Sean Robinson lies. He's got a criminal history. Yes, he paid his dues and, everyone deserves a clean start. But I don't think his behaviour changed too much personally. And so both of them are proven liars. And so if you ask them those specific questions you're looking for answers to, you cannot believe the answers you're going to get back. So you kind of just have to draw your own conclusions from the facts. So I don't think we'll ever definitively know that precise point.
Yeah. I can be talked into, I have a hard time with it, but I can be talked into thinking that was not the very same Super Nintendo, because that's actually why I brought the point up. I find it odd that somebody who has a less common Super Nintendo was also the same one that was used in the show. That's a bit too much of a coincidence. But to then say that somebody who owns a Super Nintendo wouldn't recognize the connector, to me, is a bridge too far. I'm not going to say that's what you should say. I'm not going to say that's what the audience should say. But to me, that's the point where it's like, I can't get on board with that anymore.
And readers will have different opinions on that, depending on, the way their brain works, I guess. The facts are all there, and you can make of them what you will. And there are a couple of details like that where you'll never definitively know, or never be 100% sure you're getting a truthful answer. But there are some things, lots of things in the book where, that's what happened.
So I wanted to get off Mike for a minute there. We have this is almost 5 years in the past at this point. I don't recall any major activity on this story since Mike he had a brief stint on Patreon with his magazine, and then he tried a couple things with it. But the Coleco Chameleon is a long dead story at this point. Why are you getting into the book now? What was your motivation?
Well, it's not like I've just got into it now, to be honest. This thing was an absolute monster to write. And and for a while it put me off ever doing a project like this again. It took me from start to finish 2 years, including research and writing, to get to what I thought was a finished product. So that it took me 2 years. It's kind of been on a back burner now simply because of the way the world is at the moment. And, you know, I've had quite a few changes in life as well. You know, I've gone through a big house move, gone through various other things personally, and now we're in the middle of an alleged pandemic. We won't go down that road, but and so the book has been basically finished for around a year, I would say, and that's so it's not like I've just decided to sit down after 5 years and write it. And when I started writing it, it was probably late 2016 into 17, and I didn't sit down and think, and the foreword in the book will outline this, I didn't sit down with the intention of writing this book. There were lots and lots of videos, mainly on YouTube, from people on the outside saying this is happening, that's happening, and none of it was, well, I can't say none, but a lot of it wasn't right. It was just incorrect. And so I wanted to get a kind of definitive version of events based on facts. You know, a lot of people were interested in the story and they deserve to have the correct version of the story. So I wanted to do that, but I didn't want to just write a dry, factual book full of technical information and, you know, dates and times and who said what and who did this and who did that. It would have been boring to write and even more boring to read. So I just sat down, wrote a couple of chapters, planned a few little things out, a basic book structure, and I left it maybe a week or two, went back to it, read through what I'd done, and I thought, do you know what, there's kind of an angle that I've missed here. There's a human story in here, and it's the human story of Mike. I know you wanted to get off Mike, but he is a key element to this. There is a human story. You know, the guy was doing good work for the community and kind of got lost along the way, and we can all learn lessons from that. And it follows his rise and fall, as the name suggests, and the human story. And so I'm hoping that, you know, people outside the video game community can get something from it. You know, it covers some technical information, it covers some business information, but at the heart of it, it is a human story. And I think people will, in those early chapters, quite like Mike Kennedy. I think they will. You know, I did for a long time. You know, did the show with him for, I think, 7 years, something like that. 2009 to end of 2015. And so I did like him, and, you know, he was a friend. He was a great, fun person to hang out with. And that changed. And you'll go through that story with him and see where he ended up. But it does continue kind of after the Chameleon as well, because there was a whole lot of mess to clean up after that. You know, by the time the console project was dead, Mike owed family members, you know, tens of thousands of dollars. You know, he'd been into his 401k, he'd missed mortgage payments, he had a small yacht that he kept in LA near his home. He had to sell that, he had to move house out of state, went back to live near Trisha's family. So there's all the kind of the family side of it, you know, where Mike ended up, and also what happened to the rest of his empire. And there's a great story in the book about his final dirty deed, if you like, when he was selling his empire. Of course, he sold most of it to Eli from Pico Interactive, who appeared on our show at the time, and that's where the phrase lawyers and showers came from. You know, that interview with Pico where Sean was spinning him yarn after yarn and, you know, telling him this big huge company he worked for that had lawyers and showers. And so there's all of that, you know, Mike's empire to clean up. And then we also cover some of the effect it had on Coleco after that, because Coleco, you know, made products after they put their name on the Chameleon. You know, could they rescue their name, or was that name forever tarnished? So it covers that as well. And of course there was the Coleco Expo, we cover that as well, which they did New Jersey, I think. And so we go into a little bit of that and kind of the after effects of, you know, being associated with Mike, if you like.
I'm really excited about all this because I knew about 80% of what you talked about in this episode here, but the fact that I was involved in this tangentially and still didn't know about half of this stuff was like, wow, I cannot wait to get a hold of this book. Can you describe the Kickstarter? Tell me how I can get in touch with this.
Yeah, so the Kickstarter will go live at any moment, hopefully in the next day or two. I'm not sure when this episode will come out, but it may well be live when the time it does. And
it will.
So the book is written, the book's finished. There are some legal questions because I've got some evidence in the book and a couple of other minor points we don't need to get into, but I just want to make sure that none of this book is actionable. Although everything in there can be backed up and proven true, I can tell you, why the law is such an ass. Let's have some evidence that it's argued legally I shouldn't have. Someone's given me that evidence and I put it in the book. Let's say Mike or Sean Robinson could get lawyered up and come after me and say that shouldn't be in the book. That's not true, or this aspect is not true. And I can say, well, it is true. Here's the evidence I've got to prove it. But because I shouldn't necessarily have that evidence, that's not admissible in court necessarily. So, although I can prove everything I say in the book, I may not be able to represent everything that I've got in a court of law. Now, it does depend on the state in the US, and it does depend on the country. But technically, I could be sued in a state that will not allow me to do that. The book will be published in the UK. It's largely aimed at a US audience because that's where most of the events happened, but it will be published in the UK. So I just need to answer those legal questions. So what will happen is we're doing a Kickstarter to raise the funds for those legal fees. It's a fairly low number. It's £1,400. That's it. I've got an estimate from a lawyer. I've chosen the lawyer, we've had conversations, and we're at a point now where he said, okay, send me the money, I'll do the work. And so we're raising that money. So hopefully the funded, I send the lawyer that money. He's estimated 2 to 3 weeks to get back to me. I would estimate another 2 weeks after that for me to go through the manuscript again and finalize it, and then we send it off to the publisher. So although you can never say there's no risk in backing this Kickstarter, it is negligible. The book is written, it's finished and has been for some time. So it will start any day. Like I said, it will hopefully finish the end of October. And then we're looking at a few weeks, then maybe 4 or 5 weeks till I can send the finished manuscript to the publisher and get it out there.
I'm definitely down for the book. Are there any extra tiers or extra little perks on there that I could definitely pitch in a couple extra bucks for? And
so yeah, we're again just finalizing some of those perks. There is obviously the minimum £1 where we say thank you very much and you don't get anything, and the increases Kickstarter perks like to do, and they go up to, you'll get a digital copy of the book, you'll get 3 digital copies, you'll get some artwork we're having done by an artist called Simon Butler. You may or may not know him. He worked for Ocean Software for many years, a couple of times actually, and he produces pixel art, so you can buy some of his artwork. It will be signed. We're doing some t-shirts and things like that, and the top tier will even include a dinner with me when mutually convenient. So if you're in the UK, when we can meet up, we will meet up. If you're in the US, I travel over there when we're allowed to anyway, to go to expos. So if we are in a convenient place at a convenient time, I will take you out to dinner.
You're not talking about any low serial numbers, different colored cases?
No, we're not talking that at the moment. And so what I ideally wanted to do, my plan was we go straight for a printed copy of the book and we take them to expos, sell them and sign them. Well, that's not happening this year. It's not happening the first half of next year probably. So this book sat around for long enough. As you said, it goes back to 2015. So because of where we are, let's just get it out there, get the book out there, get the information out there. Let's go digital. And when we're at a stage where we can start going to expos again, if the demand is there, we'll produce a physical book and we'll do what I said. I'll take boxes of them to expos, sign them and sell them. But the top tier does include some printed to order physical copies of the book, because you made the joke there about low serial numbers and coloured versions and all of that, but a lot of the people who read this book are collectors and want something to put on the shelf, and I want to give them something to put on the shelf. It's just that's not kind of where the world is at the moment, unfortunately.
Well, I will definitely take a look at that, and you will have a pledge from me too. Mike, I'm going to make extensive show notes for this episode because there's a lot more detail in this than in a lot of the other episodes I've done. So anybody wants some links, check out aaronbossick.com. Mike, where can people keep track of you aside from the project?
So the website for the project is, we'll give those out first and then a couple of others. The site for the project is colecochameleon.org. There's a great story in the book about how we came to own that URL and Twitter name. You can read all about that. The Kickstarter, because we don't have a final URL yet, I've put a redirect on that website, so it's colecochameleon.org/Kickstarter. Go to that URL when the project's live. It will take you straight to it. And also you can catch up with me and my current co-host, excluding Mr. Kennedy, at the Retro Gaming Roundup podcast, which is retrogamingroundup.com. We put out a monthly podcast. We've never missed February 2009. We've even thrown some extra shows in there. And if you're looking for a lot of content, that show is 5-6 hours every month. And we discuss lots of different aspects of retro gaming, as the name would.
Mike, I got to say, I am a big fan of that podcast as well. I do listen to it now and then. That's actually probably one of the few retro gaming podcasts I do listen to. So I'm going to make sure all that goes in the show notes. Mike, thank you so much for doing this, and great luck on the book.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome, and thank you for having me on and giving me the chance to get the information out there. I appreciate it.
All right. Take good care, buddy.
And you. Thanks.